All right, well, it looks like it's 10. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our virtual playground, where today we'll be discussing the decade ahead with our general partners and a special guest, Axios' future correspondent, Bryan Walsh. So I'm Allison, and I'm an operating partner at Playground Global, where I focus on marketing. And so for those of you who are attending an event for the first time here with us today, Playground Global is an early stage venture capital firm that focuses on emerging technologies. So we spend a lot of time thinking about the future and how we can build the world we want to inhabit. And so a few quick things on how this will work today before we get into it. The event's being recorded. We'll share a video with you following the event. Please feel free to use the Q&A button to ask your questions during the event. We definitely want this to be interactive. And we'll, if you can, address them to the person you'd like to answer it if you know who that is. Bryan will interview a few folks first, then we'll do Q&A at the end, including the ones that you submitted in advance when you registered. And so with no further ado, let me introduce our panel today. Peter Barrett invests in next-gen compute, life sciences, and AI. He's also a Microsoft alum and inventor of the first widely used video codec. Jory Bell invests in advanced manufacturing, space technologies, life sciences, and in a prior life, he designed computers for Apple before founding mobile computing pioneer OQO. Matt Hershenson invests in hardware and compute, and in a previous life, he created the T-Mobile Sidekick, co-created it. Bruce Leak invests in automation and logistics and is deeply interested in agriculture and sustainability. He's also the inventor of Apple's QuickTime. Lori Yoler invests in mobility, digital transformation, and cybersecurity, and she's a founding board member and early investor in Tesla. And so last but not least, before I turn the questions over to him, let me introduce Bryan Walsh, who's the future correspondent for Axios. If you don't subscribe to his newsletter, you absolutely should. It's great. He also formerly wrote for Time magazine, and he is the author of the ominously titled book, End Times, that talks about how to avoid that very outcome. And so with no further ado, Bryan, take it away.
Great, Allison, thank you so much. It's great to be here with Playground Global. And clearly this is a moment when, the future is always coming at us, but it seems like it's coming at us even faster right now. So we're getting a chance to talk about some of the tech predictions that Playground Global has over the next decade, looking at a number of different areas in compute and farming and biotech and more. So first I want to start with Peter really. And there's a piece that Playground published on Medium a couple of days ago that kind of laid out some of the technological predictions with the markers I think you all are putting out right now. And in one, you note right at the top really the importance of compute and noting that the trajectory of Moore's law is slowing down. It will eventually come to an end. So you need a new generation of high-powered computers really to enable and continue to enable the advancements we've seen in the past, and those advancements we can accelerate in the future. So without that, of course, without that compute increasing in power, this advancement stops. So Peter, first, can you explain what's fueling the revolution in computing technology that you see, and why is it so fundamental ultimately to solving some of the big problems we're facing now in society?
Great. Well, thanks, Bryan. And thanks for writing the book that inspired the 2020 apocalypse. Really appreciate that. Yeah, no, look, our civilization is built on computation, and there's an exponentially growing gap between our appetite and what Moore's law can deliver. And while we do continue to find tricks that extend Moore's law, it really is going to come to an end. And so we need to think about not only different ways of using the spectacular silicon technology we've created to work around the limitations of, say, single core CPUs, which are now, instead of doubling every 18 months in performance, double every 20 years or so. We got to find other ways of doing computation besides that old so-called von Neumann CPU model. We've also got to find entirely different ways of doing computation using quantum technologies. And I think there are forces from the growth in machine learning, which have an appetite that's doubling every 3 months to build new kinds of architectures. There are some interesting emerging alternatives to single core CPUs. But the quantum advantage is the one that I think will really be the watershed in civilization, where you can argue the computing revolution hasn't happened yet. A quantum machine can solve problems that no amount of classical computation could, and unlocks our agency over biology, our opportunity to create entirely new drugs, entirely new materials, build entire new industries, and solve problems that, the kinds of problems that have kept us indoors for the last 10 months. And to be able to engineer solutions to things which are well beyond the capabilities of today's computers. So I think it's going to be a blend of new kinds of classical computation that build on the extraordinary technology of silicon manufacturing, which is the highest form of technology humans have built. But the advent of these quantum machines really is the real computing revolution, and arguably also the real industrial revolution.
Excellent. Matt, I want to go to you. Peter mentioned, of course, the enormous appetite for data we're seeing from machine learning and other areas as well. That's going to just continue to grow. There's nothing to stop that there. And he also talked about quantum, of course. Now, the piece notes that silicon photonics in particular have a compelling advantage here. So can you talk a little bit about that and how that can actually shift the way we think about computer processing and what computer processing can actually make possible?
Sure. And thanks, want to echo Peter's thanks for hosting the event. So interconnect, it's interesting. Peter talked about the evolution of silicon and computer architectures and how Moore's law is not yielding the same exponential benefits in going into the future. It's sort of slowed. It's also interesting to take a look at where power is consumed and where some of the bottlenecks are most pronounced. And communications is an area where the power to drive at the sort of leading edge speeds of just driving a foot of copper across a circuit board at several hundred gigahertz, going in even faster as compute through alternate means can generate data at that rate. That power is growing to a point where it can come to dominate and be the limiting factor in terms of what computing can deliver. So silicon photonics in general, and silicon photonics in particular, is an important part of the solution to go forward and to continue to deliver computing advances. And so where the photonic signal can be generated as close to the chip as possible, so you're driving as little line length in the electrical domain, and most of the transmission is optical, that's an important factor in delivering future improvements to computing. There also in silicon photonics are computation methods that can be done in photonic circuits that are also an important step forward. And again, some of the advantages that you get because you're not sloshing electrons around, but instead are doing this work with photons, that's a huge step forward. And a lot of these techniques completely leverage the substantial investment that's been made in silicon fabrication. So you benefit from these decades of investment in fab and in tools and all the mass production techniques that exist, and you can make use of those in photonic circuits. I think it unleashes a lot of future potential for computing and communications.
Peter, actually, can I just go back to you for a second? Because you had mentioned quantum, and it's a subject that interests me endlessly, and yet I feel like I don't remotely come close to fully understanding. Just last week we had a paper in Science that where a team in China claimed a quantum advantage, I think, using a quantum system. When will we start to really see quantum computing making a difference in computing in the future? When will it go out of the sort of the lab really and be something that actually impacts technology in a major way?
Yeah, no, that result out of China is fascinating because it's the first time you can demonstrate that a photonic-based machine can do something that classical machines can't. And it demonstrates that we are within a handful of years of being able to build arbitrarily large quantum machines that can tackle real problems. But I think what people don't realize is there is already really interesting work on algorithmics and applications, which are yielding new results that point to the rapid adoption of these technologies when they become available at scale, with real impact to drug discovery, to room temperature superconductors, to the way we run the world, logistics, infrastructure, things that we know we need a machine to run the algorithm, but we have the algorithms, we have the applications already. And so I know that, that result in China was on an optical table. It was a small number of photons. It was doing this boson sampling thing, which doesn't have immediate practical applications. But we're very confident that those kinds of approaches can yield big machines that can do very useful work sooner than people expect, much sooner than people expect, in a handful of years.
Jory, I want to go to you, and Peter had mentioned one of the outcomes, I think, of this compute is, going into drug discovery, for instance. And so within precision medicine, we've seen in the world of biology, I mean, it's really astonishing over the past year, as terrible as the pandemic has been, and in many ways, obviously, as terrible the politics and the response around it has been, especially here in the United States, the achievement of having vaccines, mRNA vaccines, on the table, actually going into people now in the UK right now, and the FDA, I assume, going forward with vaccines today as well, with emergency use authorization. In the piece, we note that the therapies that our mRNA can produce are flexible and modular, really can move incredibly quickly. So can you talk a little bit about how mRNA modularity can be used in the future, how it could really create truly programmable smart therapeutics? And of course, when we say that, what do we actually mean?
Well, there's a few layers to unpack there. I think with the current vaccines, kind of part of what's interesting is that within days of sequencing the COVID virus, the mRNA vaccine efforts underway at companies like Moderna and BioNTech were able to kind of quickly just use that to essentially program the mRNA vaccine in order to produce the protein to create the immune response necessary to fight COVID. And so right now, kind of, if we're thinking about that, that's kind of a one-time program. Like they did that sequence, they decided what that needed to be for the vaccine, and that happened very quickly because it wasn't like a ton of lab work necessary to do that. It's going from sequencing, which it's itself is enabled by kind of the rise of computation and is on its own trajectory right now. But then in the future, kind of there are next gen mRNA technologies where the mRNA medication, be it a vaccine or another therapeutic, can respond to what's happening in the body and change its behavior. So only target if it's in diseased tissues, turn itself off if you administer a small molecule because a patient isn't reacting well to it, create different medicines in the body of the patient depending on what's happening to that particular patient. And so you'll get all of the advantages that we saw demonstrated with the kind of ability to take an mRNA kind of backbone and kind of load a program onto it, but that program will now be kind of dynamic and responsive to what's happening in the body. So precision medicine, kind of where it's essentially a piece of software. So the thing that we found super exciting about mRNA therapeutics was that they were applying computer mindset, computer engineering kind of tools and thinking to biology, to using synthetic biology in order to make it something that we could now control in a dynamic way and have personalized medicine that is kind of universally available. It's not something that has to be made from your cells in a lab. It responds to what's happening in your body when it's administered.
One thing I wonder here is that medicine obviously is a highly regulated industry, as we've seen with these vaccines. And at the same time, I think Mrna had essentially had this vaccine within weeks of the start of the pandemic. And so going forward, I don't know, what might need to happen, or what would you like to see happen around regulation that would perhaps ensure something like this could happen even faster? I mean, there are obviously lots of very, very good reasons to go through months of clinical trials and so forth to ensure something like this works, even in the case of emergency. But in the future, if medicine is moving that much quicker than the systems we built around it, is that something that needs to be shifted or changed in any way?
So, I mean, I think it's important that people still be confident in the safety of medicine. So I don't think that's an area that I would disrupt too prematurely. I think the ability to establish that an mRNA modality and backbone. So these are the first these vaccines that are now the first vaccines to come out in ridiculously fast time for this illness, for this pandemic. They're the first times that any mRNA therapeutic at all has gone through regulatory approval. So we probably accelerated medicine as a kind of silver lining to the COVID situation, by years, if not a decade, because follow on much more powerful, much more flexible mRNA therapies will be able to kind of draft off the tailwinds of now having gone through this regulatory process. I do think that we're interested in going in the future, the fact that you could have shut off switches built into these responsive medicines. So, if it's a particularly critical, time sensitive need, that you could administer it more quickly, go into trials more quickly without having to be as concerned about safety, because you can just shut it off if it's not going well for that particular patient, and then be able to assess it, not kind of stop the whole thing for weeks and redecide whether you're going to restart it. It can be individually tuned, even in the regulatory context.
Continuing with you, there's obviously nothing more personal and personalized medicine than our own genomes, and we've seen, driven in part by this amazing increase in compute power, this is the drastically falling cost of genome sequencing. You've written that it's going to get down to $100. It could get down to $10 in coming years, which is truly astonishing. And that might be something that having that sequence might be just something that's part of your annual checkup. So, at the same time, why is it beneficial really to be able to have your individual genome sequence with greater regularity? And what are the barriers that are in front of this? And how soon might we actually see this actually take place? How quickly might I actually be able to go to my doctor? And that'll be something I'll do along with every other lab test they might call for.
So I guess there are two questions there. One is how quickly, and I think that's really dependent on the cost, right? Right now, to sequence your full human genome, costs around $1,000. Like the highest volume, lab users have a little bit less, but that's the rough benchmark. And so that's not something your insurance is going to want to pay for every year without kind of some proven need. If that's $100 or $10 or a couple dollars, that's something that would be a no-brainer. And I think the reason you want it is right now, like you can look at the examples of where it is routinely used now. So cancer detection, cancer recurrence, picking optimal treatments for cancer. So oncology generally right now, you had Illumina just acquire Grail for $8 billion. You had Exact Sciences acquire Thrive Early Detection for over $1 billion. And another company that does methylation detection, Base Genomics, for $400 million. These are like quick consolidations in an industry that's becoming increasingly important as we've changed from this like brute force, one size fits all attempt at treating cancer to increasingly personalized medicine, which is based on both your genetics and the genetics of your cancer, right? So having just thinking of universal early detection based on a $10 human genome, the outcomes would be so different if we knew earlier and with more specificity, that just based on the cancer cells, or not the cancer cell, just on the snippets of cancer DNA that are floating in your blood that would be part of that sequence, you could have dramatic impacts on kind of health and survival and well-being. And I think that'll be, oncology is kind of the tip of the spear there, because it's such a devastating disease, but lots of other diseases have, almost all of the diseases have a genetic component to them as well.
Bruce, going over to you, the piece also goes on to talk about precision farming, which I think is a fascinating subject, one that doesn't get enough attention, especially considering how important agriculture is to us, how long human beings have been doing it. And it sort of plots out a future where instead of just applying water fertilizer across big fields, you actually begin to target individual plants, use the minimum amount of resources you need, thanks to great advances in sensors, information systems. So can you talk a little bit about what's missing in today's industrial farming machines, and how in the future they could be developed in a way that makes them smarter and more sophisticated? And then, of course, what does that actually lead to?
Yes, thank you, Brian. I think that I spent a bunch of time thinking about, with a growing population and a a planet under attack on so many dimensions. How do we continue to produce high quality food, with a decreasing, in some areas, a decreasing amount of land, without having an adverse impact on the planet. And in much the same way as Jory talked about, genetic sequencing for personalized medicine, the way that's going to revolutionize human healthcare is very similar to what's going to happen in agriculture. And, fundamentally, it all comes down to having a broad new set of data that you can act on. And, plant level farming, is really necessary to unlock this more food from the same amount of land with fewer inputs. In order to make plant level farming the reality, though, as you mentioned, future farm machines are going to need, several things they don't have today. They definitely need a new array of sensors to measure things like plant soil, plant health. Obviously, they have to take the weather in consideration. They need to recognize disease on the plants, and they, even need to differentiate, what are the good pests and what are the bad pests. We can't continue to take an approach which is, we're going to herbicide the entire field and we're going to kill all weeds, all plants other than the genetically modified crops. We can't continue to take a path where we're just going to clear all insects from the planet in order to be able to produce healthy food. Secondly, of course, once we have all this new data on every plant in every field, this farm equipment is going to need access to the vast amounts of processing, as we've talked about, in the earlier topics, to make sense of all these data inputs. And they need to be able to make sense of these data inputs in real time in order to orchestrate, the third requirement that farming machines are going to have, which is the ability to treat each plant differently with unique prescription, right? We can't just treat a whole row or a whole field the same. We need to look at each plant, give the appropriate amount of fertilizer, the appropriate amount of water, and treat, its pest or disease appropriately. And ideally with the least amount of change and impact on the environment.
I just want to remind everyone in the audience, please send in questions if you have any. And Bruce, just going from farming to work more broadly, how do you imagine automation and robotics, first off, I guess, making a positive impact on global workforce, especially when I think there's also a lot of fear around that? And how can we look to history to sort of show us how this transformation might happen? Of course, there have been waves of automation, there have been waves of mechanization before. Generally speaking, the economy always continues to grow, continues to become more productive, new jobs are created. Is that something we're going to expect to continue even with this newest transformation we'll be going through?
I think we are always on that continual curve of new tools and new technologies, enabling us to do more as a society and as mankind. Humans are incredible in their cognitive ability to master any task in highly complex environments. And, it's these skills that fuel many of our most innovative businesses. The challenges are, as those businesses come to scale and those tasks, required become more and more mundane and repetitive and sometimes even dangerous, what can we do in the ways of automation and robotics, which will never have the human cognitive abilities, in our lifetime, at least, despite all the advances in compute that we all dream about. And we need to empower workers to perform more fulfilling roles without the risk of injury. Personally, I don't want to see tomorrow's e-commerce warehouses become the coal mines of the 21st century. And I don't think we have to go there. I really want to create a world where robots are seen as essential to empowering us to be more productive, the same way we think about computers and the internet today.
I wonder, we want to go over to Lori to talk about the sort of the threat side of this as well. I mean, this is not just a bright future. There's also some dangers that come along with this rapid acceleration to remote work and distributed work, especially this year. And we've seen a lot of organizations dealing with really fast changing contours around cybersecurity. We've seen ransomware attacks all over the place, including directly at efforts to do COVID-19 vaccine and drug research. So, Lori, can you tell me, how are these challenges in cybersecurity information being handled by large organizations, and where does this leave an opportunity potentially for investment within this field?
Thanks. It's an interesting challenge. As you said, 2020 brought a dramatic increase in remote working. And accelerated digital businesses, which is great. You know, some of these automation techniques were finally embraced out of necessity with people not being in the office as frequently. So digital transformation brings great opportunity to enterprises, but it also brings risks of new attack surfaces for hacking. And unfortunately, it's 100 times easier to break into a system than it is to defend it. And there's been a 20% growth annually in large scale breaches in the US. So I think cybersecurity has to be taken more seriously by enterprises. And the good news is some of these tools that we've been talking about in automation, in machine learning, in quantum cryptography, all of these other technologies can be harnessed by the cybersecurity industry. But it has to be taken seriously, and it can't be a low-level back office function that's hidden somewhere in IT. So I think, you know, savvy organizations who saw so much more concern about attacks in the last year have had.
Oh, I think we may have lost Lori for a second, which I'm hoping is not a cybersecurity attack. Well, I'm going to go to a question. I hope she'll be back in a second. I'm going to go to a question from the audience, actually. And I think maybe, Peter, you can take this. And obviously, if anyone else on the panel wants to chime in, just kind of wave your hand. So smartphone sales were facing slowing growth. What do you see as the next consumer hardware that could be compared to smartphones in terms of revenue? And with that, how early should software startups get ready for the new platform? How do they evaluate the right timing for that specific application?
So I'm on the spot to predict the new platform shift
that shouldn't be hard at all, right?
With enterprise value. Look, I think you know, for me, the smartphones have settled down into a cadence which, you know, they're ubiquitous. We're always going to have them. I think that there are some opportunities to evolve that form factor and make it, you know, have some diversity rather than having canonical black rectangles. But candidly, I actually think the really interesting opportunity for software engineering lies outside of that simple model and in the diversity of opportunities that next generation compute and emerging applications for that compute. I think that's a much more fertile way to spend time, right? That we have been stuck in this abstraction of software and apps in a phone, and we've ignored the physical layer of the world at our peril. And I would encourage, if you're going to write code that touches the real world, that makes a medicine, that creates food, that creates value, using these new emerging technologies. That's the real platform shift to me. And then I think that, you know, we've been stuck in behavior modification networks and dating apps, and we need to be out in the real world doing things that move the needle. So I know it's a dodge, but I stand by it.
Speaking of the real world, this is another audience question. We can go to Bruce for this one. It seems like farming automation is mostly focused right now on harvesting rather than growing. So the question is, how will that transition happen, I imagine, from harvesting to growing, and what will drive it? And how do you see machine learning playing into agricultural innovation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, I agree that a lot of the harvesting is, you know, where the low-hanging fruit has been harvested in the past decades. But as you go to plant-by-plant farming and precision farming, it's all about, seed, it's cradle to grave, right? It's seed through harvest. And you really don't need plant-by-plant harvesting. What you need is plant-by-plant nurturing, so that you get the optimal harvest. And of course, it's all about machine learning, right? In industrial scale, no farmer can, know the right prescription for every plant, let alone be able to deliver it. And so it's all a big data play with lots of existing sensors and lots of new sensors as we learn more about, how plant biology really works and what really matters. Now that we can make an effect on it. But I think that it's super exciting, the ability to, to be able to, to get as much as you can, out of all the work we've already done, right? I mean, we're already planting the seeds. We're already watering and harvesting. We're just not getting the same results that we could if we were smarter about it at every step of the way.
Can I ask this as a follow-up to that? I mean, who's taking the lead on this? Are the big ag companies thinking of this? Are they involved in this? Do they have the expertise? Is this going to come from smaller outside insurgent players?
Yeah, I think it's mostly outside. I mean, Blue River was working on kind of a precision spraying product, got bought by John Deere, and hasn't been heard of since. Maybe they'll reappear at some point. The industry is somewhat ossified around, a lot of the value goes to the seed manufacturers and then to the chemical inputs. And there's not a lot of drive to reduce those inputs other than to the farmers that are trying to make a profit. But we just don't have a choice if we want to have a healthy planet, right? We just can't carpet bomb the soil and try to use it as a petri dish. Some of the it's not as much in the U.S., but if you look at what soybean farming has happened it's really grown heavily into South America, and with the temperature and humidity, they always have a fungus and a mold problem, and so they're just continuously just putting fungicide everywhere all the time, and it's just creating rivers of runoff. And it's not sustainable.
This is a question again from the audience for Jory. In software and hardware, it seems like debugging and testing capability has always lagged development capability detrimentally. Is this true in the mRNA world? And if so, is it something that concerns you?
So, yeah, that question makes me think I might not be thinking far enough ahead, because kind of in that right now, right, it's not really, it's a one-time programmable software model. It's not something that changes. So the normal regulatory regimes, are rigorous enough and are the kind of testing and debugging that you're talking about. So I think as those mRNA therapeutics become more truly programmable, precision, responsive to what's happening in the body, like the earliest ones, I still don't think that's a concern, but I think that's the kind of question that people should think about, and I should think about more, because it's the same as in medical devices, where for a long time they just started putting microcontrollers in them, and then they were kind of wireless, and then they could get hacked. So I think that's a question we should get ahead of, but it is not the next 5 or maybe not even the next 10 years.
But I guess it is interesting though that point that offense often tends to get ahead of defense is so true in a lot of ways. It was something we could talk about with cybersecurity, but it's particularly worrying if it's your body when you're talking about.
It is, and I mean that's definitely the flip side of a lot of these synthetic biology tools, which are allowing us to intervene in ways that are kind of transformative, and not just trying to like tweak the known levers of existing biology, but there's a lot of responsibility that goes along with that, to make sure that not only are we doing good, but we're not doing harm, right? So,
absolutely. This is a question from Matt, talking about the body and computers here. How long do you predict until brain-computer interface becomes a significant platform for multiple startups to be playing on a single, highly funded R&D type firm?
So we've seen some companies that are trying to do elements of this, and that there are more sort of kind of body mounted sensors and input devices and that kind of a thing. But the notion of kind of a helmet that you wear and your every thought goes in, I think almost to Peter's point that there's a certain novelty, and there are a number of use cases which I think are compelling for such an interface, particularly for physically handicapped or people who might have loss of sight or those kinds of things, that those interfaces could be hugely enabling and I think are very powerful. And those are interesting areas to pursue. I'm not sure that for the broad masses of people, that necessarily is as impactful as some of the kinds of things that Peter was discussing. about sort of solving real world problems as opposed to making it easier to type your email.
Mhm.
And of course, there are richer interfaces that could be developed than merely sort of all I have to do is think on a keyboard and the words appear, or of course, speech. So we have seen some efforts in that regard. I think it's probably, is measured in the order of decades, I think, until we think that kind of the conventional methods of interface are completely abandoned. But again, I would just echo the point that I don't think that's kind of the biggest, when we look back and we think about what the most powerful things that computers have done, it's not because the interface gets more fluid. I think it's about how the problems that they solve, and we've touched on a number of them in things like security, in things like agriculture, in things like medicine, in things like automation. I think those are really interesting frontiers that will have more of a difference than sort of the interface itself. Though there is interesting work there, but I think that it's 10 years off at least, I would say.
Lori, I want to go back to you since you're here. So we had been talking about cybersecurity, and one thing I always find interesting. We can see this with the pandemic right now. It often takes a major catastrophe to wake people up, wake people in power, to actually doing something about it that they probably should have done before that happened. Is that what is going to happen with cybersecurity? I mean, are we going to suffer, or some company, some country suffer something much worse than we've seen before we really take it seriously to the degree it should be?
I think the front page FireEye breach that came from likely from a nation state, hopefully it was a wake-up call. I know I sent a summary around to the boards that I'm on. The incident response plan, is technology something that we talk to enough as a board, right? It's very easy to talk about the legal and financial and operational and product items that are so much more interesting. As you said, it's a threat, it's a downer, it's a cost center. Is it something I really want to put focus on? But I think as we're moving forward and these fantastic automation technologies are coming out to make it easier for enterprises to embrace, and as there is heightened awareness, I think it's time to dust off that crisis response plan. It's time to understand what a red team is. It's time to make sure that you've got the team in place to develop it. And I think overall, enterprises and boards and executive teams who are not in the technology industry are starting to talk about technology. But it gets very confusing because it's an alphabet soup, it's a new vocabulary, it's a new language, and it's all these tools. I mean, one of the things that gets companies confused is it's this long list and plethora of different tools from these startups, and it's very difficult to know how to move forward. So I think in particular, when there are nation state actors and governments involved, I think governments play a very important role providing frameworks, much like the NIST cybersecurity framework. But I think it goes much broader than that when you do have nation state actors and when you have an entire industry of hackers that are getting more and more organized. So I think it is time for enterprises to wake up and to think about how they can automate some of that, both detection and response. But a lot of it is procedural, and it's an internal discipline, and it's working with business units to build security into products and services from the ground up, and to make security part of that fundamental architecture.
This is a question for Peter that is extremely timely for a lot of reasons. Do you predict that big tech firms will be broken up ultimately or not? And how will this affect the startup VC landscape one way or another?
Well, I think I look forward to certain Silicon Valley CEOs sweating in front of Congress. That's
Who doesn't really?
It's a profound delight. I think that there will be, hopefully next year, things will be settled down. I think that in general, if you reflect on, how we thought about Microsoft then and how we think about it now, there is a significant chance that there will be, that there's an opportunity for these large Silicon Valley tech firms, which are somewhat reviled deservedly, to survive intact. Candidly, it doesn't really have a lot of bearing on the kinds of things we invest in. That we're trying to do stuff between impossible and improbable, stuff that is almost certainly not going to work, but if it does, it will be incredibly consequential. And it's completely the other end of the Gaussian to, you know, behavior modification networks being broken up because the current administration doesn't like what they say about them. So it may, you know, it may have impact in our brethren who are shareholders in said companies, but we're focusing it at an entirely different class. And I think beyond the Schadenfreude that attends it, it's not something we think about too much.
I want to go back to Lori. This year has been transformative in many ways, one of which was how strategics took advantage of market dislocation. Playground's a leader in deep tech in part because of the relationships you built across the whole ecosystem. So what's your expectation for future partnerships with single LP platforms as they become more and more active?
So we as a firm have had a lot of terrific conversations with large strategic companies. You can imagine, given the focus in next-gen compute, in cybersecurity, in microelectronics, and in networking, in automation and robotics, in AI, in therapeutics and drug discovery. These are topics that are of interest to many, many large enterprises. And so since joining the firm, I've had lots of outreach from old friends in large enterprises who are very eager to come and spend time and understand both our viewpoints and see some of the portfolio companies we've invested in to give real life examples. You know, I spend a lot of time talking to large enterprises and members of boards of directors, and you can talk about stuff in technical mumbo jumbo and vaguely interesting. But when you get down to case studies of, hey, here's how a healthcare institution has implemented telemedicine, and here's how it's impacted the bottom line. Here's an example of a farm in Salinas that has automated weeding. Here's an example of how quantum computing could potentially solve this problem. Here's what mRNA is, and here's why we think it's going to be so powerful in vaccine discovery. And giving real life examples and letting people talk to real companies is really what resonates.
Matt, maybe this go to you. What trend did you recently change your mind about, and why? Assuming there is a trend that you have recently changed your mind about.
Wow. So I think there, you know, that exists on a bunch of different levels. It's interesting to see how things happen, both kind of in a technical realm, also in a business realm, and then sort of in a public realm. I mean, I think obviously, I think that we've learned, it's been interesting to see how work from home has become far more practical than I think anybody ever thought it would be. So that's kind of in the latter aspect of it, you know, sort of in the latter category of it. On the technical side, I think that the thing which has struck me the most is that I think that there's going to be, you know, consolidation of a number of different technologies where there's segments that there are many companies going after, where I think it's hard to have a differentiated solution. And so I think that consolidation it may come earlier to some startups than I had thought would happen. And I think things like SPACs are accelerating that. And so I think that the trend of how startups will evolve is changing based on how some may sort of seek an expedited path to liquidity. And so I used to think that it would always take quite a long time. And I think that there are some companies that are going to short circuit that. I mean, that's not necessarily a technical prediction, but that's more sort of in the world of venture and how companies evolve. That's something that has struck me recently that I think is a pretty big change that, you know, I didn't see coming, I would say.
Jory, this is for you. Similar aspects of this, from your sort of earlier comments, similar aspects of intuitive adaptability of deep learning models are being seen through unsupervised and self-supervised learning. The questioner's doing some of that with computer vision. What do you see as the impediments for progress there? Is it compute? Is it algorithmic research? Are there ethical questions?
So I'm going to ask Peter to jump in on that one. That sounds more his wheelhouse.
Okay.
I think one of the challenges with ML in general is, its opacity, and that, you're doing this amazing dimensionality reductions. I can now, for the first time, use AlphaFold 2 and get a sense of how I go from codon sequences to some geometry. Those are incredibly powerful and versatile tools, but the more complicated the application, the more we get into agency over our biology and trying to understand how to be in there with the other, 20,000 odd protein-based machines that operate us. We're going to need new classes of ML tools that are composable and transparent and understandable. So, our interaction with the world is not through an arbitrarily large black box. And so deep learning, you look at how rapidly that has, the super exponential growth and demands for deep learning, that's unsustainable. We have to find other models for, sparsity, but also for composing AIs that have the transparency we need to use them safely, have the transparency we need to do things like, in silico toxicity or integrating the mechanisms in our body and measuring them in ways where we can trust what's going on and we can see what's going on. And there's some really interesting new results in neurosymbolic architectures that do that. I think we're just at the dawn of it, but we, to fulfill our entire ambitions, we need entirely new classes of ML, not just for mRNA replicons, but for, robot interactions, for having those intelligences do what we want them to do in a way that we can understand and manage.
This is for Bruce. What do you find is the most underappreciated and underfunded technology with big potential?
That's a good one.
And where can I invest in it, I suppose, as well?
Sounds great. I mean, my personal view is that we don't pay enough attention, both good and bad, to the ocean. I mean, we definitely strip farm the ocean from a live catch point of view, with a lot of byproduct that we throw away, and we do horrible things to it. But with kind of 2/3 of the world's surface, these aren't deserts. And if we partner with nature, versus try to beat her, I believe that whether it's food from the ocean in a sustainable manner, whether it's other essential products, I think the ocean is way misunderstood because we only see the shores of it, and I think that there is a vast amount of opportunity there in a world positive way, not just yet another resource that we can have a tragedy of the commons with.
As a follow-up to that, I'm curious what you think of cultured meat. I mean, including cultured fish. I mean, one thing that's obviously something I'm very interested in when we think about both land and ocean. So much of that space goes to feeding human beings right now, not always very efficiently. Here's an option, possibly. At the same time, I'm not sure how feasible it is. So just curious your thoughts there.
Yeah, so it's something as a partnership we look at a lot. I mean, and it's certainly in the how to sustainably feed the world. Is it alternative proteins? Is it cultured meat? I mean, certainly there's the promise of cultured meat from animal husbandry, from decreasing suffering. There's the promise from a more efficiency from inputs. If you could generate beef without the CO2 outputs and the land inputs and all the water, we haven't seen anything where that looks economically viable anytime soon. I think there's some definite benefits to that strategy. I think that there's, like I said, on the ocean side, I think there are a lot of opportunities to improve other approaches to producing protein that is human appropriate. I think there's lots of such opportunities with the ocean. I also think that we can do things like sustainably raise fish in the ocean, and versus the approaches we use today that may be more straightforward. than growing tissue in labs for consumption. But someday, someday it may make a lot of sense. I mean, the billions of creatures that we grow annually to feed ourselves, is hard to imagine how we sustain that in a growing population who wants more protein.
Absolutely. So I'm going to ask one last question to each panelist here, the same one. So maybe Lori, I'll start with you. As you look to the decade ahead, what problems are you most excited about solving, and what areas of investment do you find to be most promising?
So I'm very interested to see incredibly useful applications of AI and machine learning to solve automation problems and big problems within enterprises. I'm excited to see those same technologies making companies much more resilient from a cyber perspective. And then I'm watching digital currencies because I think, unfortunately, ransomware has focused attention on Bitcoin. And I think as I'm looking at other nations, I'm seeing that digital currencies are certainly coming. And many of these same technologies underpin the effectiveness of digital currencies. You need robust networks, you need safe, secure enclaves for computing, you need, it's taking all of these traditional enterprise applications and making them even more critical in financial services. So I'm watching what's happening in that arena as well. And I think there's been an acceleration over the last few years as the world has been looking for innovation in payment systems. And I think you see even some of the main players like PayPal and Visa starting to embrace them.
Matt, go to you. Same question. What problems you're most excited about, or areas of investment you find most promising?
So I think I think they kind of converge in a number of different ways, and I'll pick one area, but that's robotics and automation. I think that a lot of what is out there now has been sort of narrowly focused, and it's been a lot of work for the hardware and more so the software developers working in automation to very carefully construct their solutions to a narrow set of problems, kind of one by one, taking a look at automation. And I think that it's not necessarily a near-term thing, but I think going forward, the kinds of revolutions that happen in software, as Peter talked about some in AI and ML, I think we'll see an increasing application of those kinds of techniques to automation problems that will prompt the creation of much broader solutions in the automation space. And we're seeing some of our companies do that now, but I think that that's an area where there's going to be tremendous advances as the power of those software techniques around machine learning and the greater availability of compute is going to be brought to bear against sort of conventional automation in the areas of warehouse automation, in locomotion, and in farming across a pretty broad range of things. So I think automation is an area where I'm particularly excited, and I think there's going to be a lot of changes.
All right, Jory, over to you.
I think the areas that I'm focused on investing in kind of reflect those areas that I think are kind of most interesting. So next gen manufacturing, I think it's like a lot of very old technologies and methods are still the basis for much of what we make. And so mainstreaming kind of things like industrial scale metal printing and having that transition from only the highest value parts like the SpaceX Raptor engine into kind of things that you would have made with a CNC or a casting. I think so in general, space technology is an area where I think there's been an inflection point between some number of decades ago it was only nation states, then it was companies, startups by a few billionaires, and now it's something that the price point, because of new technologies and the applications that we've enabled in especially in low Earth orbit now, but I think increasingly going deeper into space, mean that there's kind of a new renaissance of entrepreneurs and new applications and business opportunities being developed there. So I think that's a really exciting area. And then kind of the life sciences and kind of the intersection, especially of bringing like high-powered compute, automation, kind of high throughput assays in order to be able to really control biology in new ways, and go to more precision medicine, as that kind of term we're using earlier. I also think there's one last thing that I think is really fascinating that runs through a number of the discussions we had today, is that I particularly am interested in finding ways to leverage the huge investment that our civilization has made in semiconductor fabrication in order to underpin, like that iPhone question before. I'm more interested in taking the infrastructure that we built to make that kind of magic box possible, and then transitioning that into other industries, whether it's diagnostic tools and gene sequencing or metal printing. And we see across our portfolio a recurrent theme of the engineering and engineering management expertise and specific technologies that were developed to make your iPhone and the whole semiconductor world turn, being transitioned in really amazingly transformative ways into totally unrelated adjacent industries.
Bruce, your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm optimistic that as we come through this pandemic, and as we learn how to better work, through this episode, remotely, that we continue to create tools that ideally will help us rebuild our sense of community, beyond just these small bubbles that we live in, and kind of break down the polarization that has come from a divisive political season. Fundamentally, I don't believe that there are red and blue people in the world, and I hope that kind of this shared pandemic will help us recognize our shared humanity, and ideally find some tools to break down barriers, cross those lines, and look for ways to connect and unite people behind this common goal of we all share. And it's not not whether you're an American or a non-American. We all have to build a livelihood, live in a planet that is sustainable, and think about future generations.
Absolutely. Before I go to Peter, there was a question for Lori. There are books on that desk. Would you like to mention what you're reading?
Jory was making fun of me having these old-fashioned, non-digitized books. He's leaving now. Oh, he's pulling some board. But I have not read. I've skimmed through Quantum Computers, but I have not read it yet. I'm very sorry. Nor have I read the Relativity Payload User's Guide. However, if you have not read Unapologetically Ambitious by Shelley Archambault, phenomenal book about an entrepreneur's journey and extraordinary going against all odds. And then I just got David Eagleman's new book, who wrote The Brain and Some, and it's called Livewired. And he is one of my favorite neuroscientists, so and he's a great writer. So I'm very excited. I'm just cracking that open now. Thanks for the question.
No problem. Okay, Peter, last for you, your thoughts on sort of things you're excited about. And also, I should say, someone was wondering on Moore's Law prediction. In the past, it's been predicted to end before. What's different now as well? So you can choose which one you want to answer.
Well, there's an old adage about predictions about the end of Moore's Law follow an exponential curve, which is roughly Moore's Law shape. Yeah, Moore's Law really is coming to an end. Dennett scaling stopped years ago. We're down at 5 nanometer. You just run out of atoms, right? You can turn it sideways and make FinFETs only so long. You need different architectures. And there are architectures that are 10 to 100 times faster than single core CPUs. We know them, they're demonstrable, and those things are going to have an impact. But I think about this in terms of, look, photosynthesis as a technology, what's that worth? Our entire, the entire ecosphere on the planet depends on it. We're building machines that can develop technologies which are going to be as important as photosynthesis. Those machines are going to be built in the same fabs that are building the chips that go into your cell phones today. We know how to make them. They're going to happen sooner than later. And so, our ability to correct some of the missteps of the last 200 years in destroying the ecosystem can be undone by this. We can terraform Earth. We should get to that before we do it on Mars. But we're going to have those tools. And if people lean into that and embrace it, you can build extraordinarily large companies that create extraordinary value for everybody in a non-zero sum game world where it really moves the needle and doesn't make the world a shittier place in the process. So those are the kinds of things. I get vertigo thinking about the applications of these new kinds of compute. And I'm honored to make some contribution to concentrate the capital to help make it happen.
Excellent. Well, that's a suitably ambitious note, I think, to end on. Thank you, Peter, Bruce, Matt, Jory, and Lori. Thank you, Allison and Playground Global. And thank you to the audience for taking time out of your schedule to watch us. Thanks again.
Thanks, Bryan.
Thanks. Great.